I was mid-sentence when the sky cracked open, and everything I knew about the galaxy changed forever. The comms officer beside me, Nathan Webb, had just handed me a mug of cold coffee. I was dictating a supply request to Earth Colonial Command, something mundane about replacement water filters for the hydroponic bay. Then the ceiling shook. The lights flickered, and the alarm that none of us had ever heard outside of a drill started screaming through every corridor of Outpost Cygnus 7. I dropped the coffee. Nathan was already pulling up the exterior cameras. When the feed loaded, neither of us spoke. We just stood there and watched the end of the world descend from orbit. Hundreds of ships, not civilian transports, not trading vessels. Warships, black and angular, covered in ridged plating that looked like the carapace of some enormous insect. Velthari warships. I had seen them in intelligence briefings. Grainy images taken from long range by recon drones. I had never seen them in person. Nobody at Cygnus 7 had. The Velthari Dominion controlled a stretch of space on the other side of the neutral corridor. And for the 8 decades since humanity had entered the interstellar stage, they had been cold, distant, and officially non-hostile. Diplomatic channels existed but were rarely used. They saw us as beneath their attention. Until now. The first salvo hit the civilian quarter, not the garrison, not the weapons batteries, not the shield generators. The civilian quarter, where 4,000 people lived, worked, raised families, and sent their children to school. The impact turned 3 residential towers into cascading fireballs that rolled outward through the connecting walkways and collapsed an entire section of the habitat dome. I felt the floor heave under my boots and grabbed the edge of the console. The screaming started. Not the alarm. People. I could hear them through the comms channels that were still open, calling for help, calling for their children, calling names that would never answer. Nathan looked at me. His face was gray. He was 26 years old, and he had joined the colonial service because he wanted to see the frontier. Now the frontier was on fire. I switched the comms to garrison frequency. My voice came out steady, which surprised me, because inside my chest something was shaking apart. I said, "All units, this is Commander Harmon. We are under attack. Hostile Velthari forces inbound. This is not a drill. Fall back to defensive positions around the civilian shelters. Protect the people first. Weapons free." There were 300 Marines at Cygnus 7. 300, against what the sensors were now telling me was a fleet of over 200 warships and at least 40 troop transports. The math was not complicated. It was a death sentence. But not one of those Marines hesitated. Every single one of them moved toward the danger. The Velthari ground forces hit the surface within minutes. I watched them pour out of their dropships on the exterior cameras, towering insectoid soldiers standing nearly 8 feet tall, covered in natural chitinous armor that made them look like walking nightmares. Their compound eyes reflected the firelight from the burning colony. They moved in disciplined formations, clicking and buzzing in their hive-mind coordination, each unit responding to some central intelligence that directed them like fingers on a single hand. Our Marines met them at the perimeter. Corporal Claire Maddox, who ran the morning fitness sessions and always had a joke for everyone, was the first one I saw engage. She fired her rail rifle from behind a barricade made of cargo containers and dropped 2 Velthari soldiers before a plasma bolt cut through the metal beside her and sent her diving for cover. She popped up again and kept shooting. But for every Velthari that fell, 3 more stepped forward. Their weapons were different from ours, energy-based projectors that fired superheated plasma in tight pulses. Where those pulses hit, metal melted and concrete turned to glass. Our armor could take 1 hit, rarely 2. I left the command center and moved through the colony toward the civilian shelters. On the way, I passed things I will never talk about in detail. Families running through smoke-filled corridors, a man carrying a child who was not moving, a medic working on someone in the middle of a hallway, ignoring the explosions above, hands covered in red. These are the things that the diplomatic transcripts never mention, the things that become statistics in the reports. But they were not statistics to me. They were my people. The Velthari broadcast a message as their ground forces advanced. It came through on every open channel, spoken in broken but understandable English. The voice was flat, translated through some device that could not capture the insectoid clicking, that formed their natural language. It said, "This territory belongs to the Dominion. Your kind will learn its place. Resistance is an insult to superior civilization. Lay down your weapons and accept judgment." Nobody laid down a thing. Sergeant Marcus Vega, who had been stationed at Cygnus 7 for 4 years and knew every maintenance tunnel and service shaft in the colony, started leading squads through the underground corridors to hit the Velthari from unexpected angles. They rigged point defense turrets at choke points. They filled corridors with improvised explosive traps built from mining charges and fuel cells. They turned every hallway into a killing ground. It slowed the Velthari. It did not stop them. I reached the main communications tower and found it already half destroyed. The primary antenna array was gone, sheared off by an orbital strike, but the secondary systems were still functioning, buried in a hardened bunker beneath the tower's foundation. I crawled through the wreckage with Nathan and a technician named Sophie Grant, who had a cut above her eye that was bleeding steadily and did not seem to care. Sophie got the backup transmitter running in under 4 minutes. I have never seen anyone work that fast under those conditions. Her hands were steady even when the walls shook around us. I recorded the distress signal myself. Colony identification codes, visual confirmation of the attackers from our camera feeds, a casualty count that was climbing so fast the numbers blurred, and a single line that I added at the end, not because protocol demanded it, but because I wanted whoever heard it to understand what was happening here. They are targeting civilians. They are targeting families. This is not a border dispute. This is a massacre. We sent the signal. The transmitter burned out 30 seconds later, when another orbital strike hit the tower above us, and the shock wave traveled down through the structure like a fist. Sophie was thrown against the wall. Nathan pulled her up. We ran. The next 2 hours were a nightmare painted in fire and noise. The Velthari pushed deeper into the colony. Our Marines fought for every meter, but meter by meter they were pushed back. I watched the defensive perimeter shrink on my tactical display, a glowing circle that contracted like a closing eye. Each contraction meant another section of the colony lost, another group of civilians who had not made it to the shelters. I found Sergeant Vega at the entrance to the sub-basement bunkers, directing the last wave of civilians underground. He had a burn across his shoulder that had melted through his armor and scorched the skin beneath. But he stood there as if it were nothing, counting heads, shouting directions, physically lifting a woman who had frozen in panic and carrying her down the stairs. I told him the distress signal had been sent. He looked at me with eyes that were too tired for hope but too stubborn for surrender. He said, "Then we hold, Commander. We hold until someone comes." We moved everything underground. 312 civilians, 43 Marines still able to fight, most of them carrying wounds. Medical supplies that would last maybe 2 days, water for 3, air recyclers that were damaged and running at 60% capacity. Above us, the Velthari took the colony. We could hear them through the rock and metal, their heavy footsteps vibrating through the structure, their communications buzzing on frequencies we could partially intercept. They were not in any hurry. They believed the fight was over. The last Marine guarding the main bunker entrance was a young private named Derek Hale. He was 22 years old. He had been at Cygnus 7 for 3 months. He volunteered to hold the entrance while the blast doors sealed, and I let him because there was no other choice. I heard his rifle firing as the doors closed. Rapid shots, controlled, professional. Then a pause, then nothing. The blast doors sealed with a sound like a coffin lid closing. In the silence that followed, I checked the backup receiver one more time. It was a small unit, hardened against electromagnetic interference, buried deep enough in the rock that the Velthari might not detect it. The screen was dark, no response from Earth, no acknowledgement, no promise that anyone had heard us. For all I knew, we had screamed into empty space. I sat down against the cold metal wall of the bunker and listened to the sound of children crying somewhere deeper in the shelter. Around me, the surviving Marines checked their weapons and their wounds and said nothing. There was nothing to say. Then the Velthari started working on the blast doors. We could hear the cutting tools, a high-pitched whine that vibrated through the metal and set everyone's teeth on edge. They were coming in. Not fast, but steady. They would breach the outer door within hours. I stood up. I checked my sidearm. 7 rounds in the magazine. Not enough for what was coming. Not nearly enough. But enough to make a point. I looked at the people around me, civilians and soldiers alike, and I saw something in their faces that the Velthari had not accounted for. Not hope exactly, because hope requires belief in a future, and most of us were not sure we had one. Something else. Something harder, and older, and more dangerous. Defiance. I raised my sidearm and walked toward the sound of cutting tools. 7 rounds. 7 statements that we were still here, still breathing, still refusing to accept judgment from anyone. The outer door buckled inward with a shriek of tearing metal, and the first Velthari soldier stepped through. 8 feet of chitin and compound eyes and alien arrogance. I fired all 7 rounds into its chest. The impact staggered it, cracking the outer layer of its armor, and green fluid leaked from the fractures. It stumbled but did not fall. Behind it, more shapes moved in the smoke and dust, dozens of them, an army pressing in through a hole barely wide enough for 2 at a time. Then the world behind them exploded. The shaped charge that Sergeant Vega had planted above the corridor ceiling detonated with a sound that I felt in my bones more than heard. The blast wave channeled down the narrow passage and hit the Velthari squad like a wall of pure force. Rock and metal collapsed. Dust billowed through the breach. The corridor beyond was gone, replaced by a mountain of rubble that sealed the entrance more effectively than any blast door. Silence. Real silence. Then coughing, groaning, the sound of people picking themselves up off the floor. Vega appeared beside me, covered in dust, bleeding from a fresh cut on his forehead. He looked at the collapsed corridor, and then at me. That bought us a few hours, Commander. Maybe more. Depends on how badly they want in. I looked at the rubble. Behind it, somewhere in the ruins of our colony, the Velthari were regrouping. Above us, their fleet held orbit, and somewhere across the vast emptiness of space, a distress signal was either racing toward Earth or dying in the static between stars. I did not know which. I went back to the backup receiver and sat beside it, watching the dark screen, waiting for a light that might never come. The hours that followed were the longest of my life, not because of the fighting, which had paused, not because of the wounded, who filled the back chambers of the bunker with sounds I tried not to hear. The hours were long because of the waiting. I organized what we had left, 43 Marines who could still hold a weapon, though 12 of them probably should not have been standing. 312 civilians, including 61 children. Sophie Grant took over the technical operations, pulling power from every non-essential system to keep the air recyclers running and the lights on. A retired structural engineer named Graham Cole, who was 73 years old and had come to Cygnus 7 to spend his last working years doing something that mattered, began mapping the sub-basement tunnel network and identifying points where we could collapse passages or redirect the Velthari if they broke through again. Sergeant Vega ran the defense. He divided the remaining Marines into 3-person fire teams and positioned them at every possible entry point. He rationed ammunition with the precision of a man who understood that every bullet had to count because there would be no resupply. He moved through the bunker with calm authority that never wavered, speaking quietly to the wounded, checking positions, adjusting plans. I had known him for 4 years, and I had never once seen him rattled. But when he came to me privately, away from the others, his voice was different. Commander, we have maybe 36 hours of breathable air if the recyclers hold. If they fail, half that. The Velthari are going to find another way in. They have ground-penetrating sensors. They know we are here. I knew all of this. Hearing it stated plainly did not make it easier. What do you need from me? I asked. He looked at me with those steady dark eyes. I need you to keep these people believing that someone is coming. Because the moment they stop believing that, we lose them. So that became my job. Not commanding a defense, not planning tactics, not rationing supplies. My job was to walk through that bunker and look every terrified face in the eye and tell them, with absolute conviction, that Earth had heard us and that help was on the way. I did not know if it was true. I told them anyway. I walked the bunker from end to end, through chambers that had been designed for equipment storage and maintenance access. not for sheltering hundreds of frightened people. The air was thick with the smell of dust and sweat, and the sharp chemical odor of medical sealant. In one chamber, a group of engineers had set up a makeshift water purification station using filters pulled from the colony's life support system. In another, someone had hung emergency lights in a pattern that almost resembled something welcoming, a small act of domestication in a place that was anything but domestic. There was a school teacher named Lena Price who had organized the children into a group in one of the storage rooms. She had them sitting in circles, playing word games, singing songs quietly, anything to keep them from hearing the sounds that echoed through the tunnels. She had been shot in the arm during the evacuation, and someone had wrapped it with a strip torn from a uniform jacket. She never mentioned it. When I checked on her, she looked up at me and said, "Just tell me the truth, Commander. Are we going to die down here?" I knelt beside her, so the children would not hear. "Not if I have anything to say about it." She studied my face for a long moment, looking for the lie. Then she nodded, turned back to the children, and started another song. The Velthari did not try to breach the collapsed corridor again. Instead, we heard a new sound. Deep, rhythmic vibrations that traveled through the rock and made the walls hum. They were drilling. Not through the rubble, through the bedrock itself, coming at us from a direction we had not defended because nobody builds blast doors inside solid rock. Sophie tracked the vibrations on a handheld seismic monitor she cobbled together from spare parts. She plotted their direction and depth. They are coming from the northeast, about 40 meters out and closing. At the rate they are moving, they will reach the outer edge of the bunker network in 6 hours. 6 hours, I did the math again. Air for 36. Velthari drilling through in 6. And somewhere in the space between here and Earth, a distress signal that might have already been lost in the cosmic noise. I went back to the backup receiver and stared at its dead screen as if I could will it to life through concentration alone. Nothing. Not a flicker. I sat there for 20 minutes, my head against the cold wall, listening to the distant thrum of alien drilling equipment chewing through rock. Then I did something I had not done since I was a child. I closed my eyes and I simply asked the universe for one thing. Not for myself. For the 312 people behind me who had done nothing to deserve this. The screen stayed dark. I opened my eyes and stood up and went back to work. Because that is what you do when hoping is not enough. You work. Graham Cole found something useful. The sub-basement network was more extensive than anyone had mapped. There were maintenance shafts, old excavation tunnels from when the colony was first built, even a natural cave system that connected to the deeper rock. We could not escape through them because the Velthari had the surface locked down, but we could use them to redirect where the drill would break through. "If I collapse this section here," Graham said, pointing to his hand-drawn map with a finger that was gnarled from decades of honest work, "the path of least resistance shifts. Their drill will follow the fracture line into this chamber instead of the main bunker." "What is in that chamber?" I asked. He smiled. It was a thin, hard smile. "Nothing yet, but Sergeant Vega is about to make it very interesting." We spent the next 4 hours preparing. Vega turned that empty chamber into something that would make a weapons engineer weep with admiration, or horror, depending on their disposition. Fuel-air explosives, built from the colony's emergency fuel reserves. Overcharged power cells wired in series. Fragments of metal and broken equipment packed into shaped containers that would turn into storms of shrapnel when detonated. It was ugly. It was improvised. It was the kind of weapon that only people with nothing left to lose would build. The drilling sound grew louder. The vibrations intensified until they seemed to live inside my bones. Everyone in the bunker felt it. The children stopped singing. I intercepted fragments of Velthari communications during the wait. Their encryption was sophisticated, but Sophie had figured out enough of their modulation patterns to pull meaning from the static. What I heard made the cold in my stomach spread into my chest. They were broadcasting back to their empire. They were not just reporting a military victory. They were celebrating it. They were showing images of the destroyed colony, the burning buildings, the bodies. They were presenting it to their population as entertainment. A commentator, if that is the right word for whatever narrated their broadcasts, described the attack on Cygnus 7 as a cleansing of inferior biological contamination. The audience numbers were in the hundreds of millions. They were watching us die for fun. I turned off the intercept and sat in silence for a long time. Around me, the people of Cygnus 7 huddled in the dim light, wounded and frightened, and brave in a way that no alien broadcast would ever capture or understand. A teenage boy whose name I later learned was Elliot was hauling ammunition boxes from a storage cache to the fire teams, making trip after trip without being asked. A woman who worked in the colony's agricultural lab was using her knowledge of chemistry to help Vega build more explosives. An old man sat in the corner, quietly sharpening a piece of metal into something that might serve as a weapon if everything else failed. This is what humans do, I thought. This is what they cannot understand about us. We do not stop. The drill broke through at the 5-hour mark, 1 hour earlier than Sophie had predicted. The wall of the decoy chamber cracked and then crumbled inward, and the drill head, a massive rotating disc of alien alloy, pushed through in a shower of rock dust and debris. Behind it came the Velthari. They poured through the opening with the confidence of predators entering a cage where the prey had nowhere left to run. Their compound eyes adjusted to the dim light. Their weapons swept the chamber. They clicked and buzzed in that hive-mind communion, coordinating without visible signals, moving as one organism. They did not see the wires. They did not notice the shaped charges. They did not understand what the fuel drums positioned along the walls were for. Vega waited until 40 of them were inside. Then he pressed the detonator. The explosion traveled through the tunnels like thunder, trapped in a bottle. The decoy chamber ceased to exist. The walls between it and the drill shaft collapsed, sending a cascade of rubble back the way the Velthari had come. The shockwave knocked people off their feet even in the main bunker, 2 corridors away. Dust filled the air so thick you could barely see. When the noise faded, Vega did a head count. We had lost 2 Marines in the collapse, and 7 civilians had minor injuries. But the Velthari assault force that had entered the chamber was gone, buried under tons of rock, and the drill shaft behind them was sealed with enough debris to buy us more time. How much time, I did not know. Vega found me as the dust settled. He was filthy, his armor cracked in 3 places, his left hand wrapped in a makeshift bandage that was already soaked through. He said, "That is the last big trick we have, Commander. Next time they come through, we fight them with what is left. And what is left is not much." I nodded. Then I walked back to the backup receiver, past the huddled civilians, past the wounded Marines, past Lena Price, who had started singing again, in a voice that cracked but did not stop. The screen was dark. I put my hand on it, just rested my palm against the cold surface, and I whispered, "Come on, come on." The screen flickered. A single line of text appeared, bright green against the black. Not an automated response this time, not a system acknowledgement. A live transmission, encoded with fleet-grade encryption that only active military vessels carried. The words were simple, and they changed everything. Outpost Cygnus 7. This is Battle Group Fenris. We are inbound. Estimated arrival, 11 hours. Hold your position. I read it 3 times. Then I read it a 4th time, because my hands were shaking so badly that the words blurred. Then I stood up, and I walked to the center of the main bunker, where everyone could see me. Civilians looked up from their huddles. Marines turned from their positions. Children peered out from behind Lena Price. I held up the receiver so they could see the green text glowing in the dim light. I did not need to say anything. The words spoke for themselves. For a moment, nobody moved. Then someone started crying. Then someone started laughing. Then Sergeant Vega, who I had never once seen display any emotion stronger than mild irritation, closed his eyes and let out a breath that seemed to empty his entire body. 11 hours, he said quietly. Then he opened his eyes, and his voice was iron again. The drill can be restarted. They will come again. We hold for 11 hours. I looked at the people around me. Broken, bleeding, terrified, stubborn, magnificent people. And I said the only thing that mattered. Earth heard us. They are coming. All we have to do is survive until they get here. A voice came from somewhere in the back. It was Elliot, the teenager. He said, "Then we survive." Nobody argued. We got to work. 11 hours. The Velthari drill was estimated to reach us again in 6, maybe less, now that they knew the layout of the rock. I stood in the center of the bunker, with Sophie's seismic monitor in one hand and Graham Cole's tunnel map in the other, and I started planning the most desperate 5 hours of my life. We had used our biggest trap. The fuel reserves that made those explosives possible were gone. The power cells were spent. We had ammunition for maybe one sustained firefight, if you define sustained as something that lasted 15 minutes. After that, it would come down to whatever we could swing, stab, or throw. 15 minutes against an army that had conquered worlds for 12,000 years. The math was worse than before, and it had never been good. I split our resources 3 ways. First, Sergeant Vega took 20 Marines and began fortifying the 2 remaining entry points with everything we had left. They welded scrap metal into barricades. They stacked containers of rock and equipment into barriers that would slow the Velthari down by minutes, maybe less. They rigged the last of our mining charges at the narrowest choke points. Small charges this time. Not enough to collapse tunnels, but enough to ruin someone's day. Second, Sophie Grant led a team of civilians in what I can only describe as electronic warfare, conducted with spit and prayers. She stripped every piece of technology we had left: tablets, medical scanners, personal communicators, even a child's educational toy, and built signal jammers from the components. Crude, ugly, barely functional signal jammers that broadcast on the frequencies the Velthari used for their ground-penetrating sensors. It would not stop the drill, but it would confuse their targeting. They would not know exactly where our main chamber was. They would have to guess. Third, Graham Cole took a team into the deeper tunnels and started collapsing secondary passages, not to trap the Velthari, but to redirect the path of their drill. Every time we changed the structure of the rock around us, we changed the fracture lines. The drill would follow those fracture lines because that was the path of least resistance. Graham was essentially herding a monstrous piece of alien engineering through the bedrock by strategically weakening the stone in the directions we wanted it to go. It was brilliant. It was insane. It was the kind of plan that only works when the people executing it are too stubborn to consider that it should not work at all. I moved between all 3 groups, checking progress, adjusting plans, doing the thing Vega had asked me to do, which was keeping people believing, because belief, in those hours, was as essential as ammunition. A Marine who believed help was coming would fight differently than one who had accepted death. A civilian who believed in survival would help dig and build and carry instead of curling into a corner and waiting for the end. So I talked to them. I told them about Battle Group Fenris. I did not know much, but I knew the name. Every soldier in the colonial service knew the name. Fenris was not a peacekeeping force. It was not a diplomatic escort. Battle Group Fenris was a hammer, and it had been built for exactly one purpose: to hit something so hard that it never got back up. The hours ground past. The drilling sound returned, a deep mechanical growl that vibrated through everything and made the water in our emergency containers ripple. Sophie's jammers forced the Velthari to recalibrate twice, costing them nearly an hour each time. The first recalibration happened when her primary jammer overloaded their sensor sweep and sent back false density readings, making their drill veer left into a section of solid granite that slowed their progress to a crawl. The second happened when she switched frequencies and fed their scanners ghost images of hollow chambers that did not exist, sending the drill chasing phantoms through the bedrock. Graham's tunnel collapses redirected the drill path 3 times, sending it on winding detours through the rock that bought us precious additional time. He moved through the tunnels with a calm that seemed impossible for a man his age, tapping walls with a geological hammer, listening to the echoes, reading the rock the way a musician reads sheet music. Each controlled detonation was placed with absolute precision, cracking the stone along natural grain lines to create the fracture paths he wanted. Between the technical operations, I checked on the civilians. The atmosphere in the deeper chambers had changed since the message from Battle Group Fenris. Fear was still there, you could smell it in the recycled air, but it had been joined by something else: purpose. People who had been huddling in shock were now moving, helping, contributing in whatever way they could. A retired nurse named Catherine worked alongside the combat medics, treating dehydration and anxiety with equal competence. A maintenance worker named Owen discovered a secondary water line that had not been mapped, adding precious hours to our supply estimates. But time is a resource that eventually runs out, no matter how carefully you spend it. At the 5-hour mark, the drill changed direction sharply. It had found a fracture line that Graham had not accounted for, a natural fault in the bedrock that ran directly toward the main bunker. The seismic monitor showed the drill moving fast now, chewing through weakened stone at twice its previous rate. 30 minutes, Sophie said, her voice flat with exhaustion. She had not slept in over 20 hours. None of us had. I gathered the Marines at the point where Graham predicted the breach would occur. 23 of them could still stand. The rest were propped against walls with weapons in their laps, determined to fight, even if they could not stand to do it. The civilians had been moved to the deepest chamber, as far from the expected breach point as the bunker network allowed. Vega stood beside me. He had stopped bothering with his injuries. Blood had dried on his face in dark streaks that made him look like something out of ancient history, a warrior painted for his last battle. He checked his rifle one final time and said, "When they come through, we hit them hard and fast, force them into the choke point, detonate the mining charges when the first wave is inside. After that, we improvise." "Improvise," I repeated. He almost smiled. "It means we fight with whatever we have, until we cannot fight anymore." I checked my sidearm. Someone had given me a fresh magazine, 12 rounds. I also had a metal pipe that one of the engineers had shaped into something approximating a club. It was not a weapon I had ever trained with, but it was heavy and hard, and it was better than empty hands. The drilling sound became a roar. The wall at the end of the corridor began to crack, lines spreading across the rock like dark veins. Dust fell from the ceiling in sheets. The air trembled. Then it stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise. It meant the drill had pulled back. It meant the Velthari were about to come through. The wall blew inward. Not from an explosion. From brute force, something massive hit it from the other side, and the weakened rock shattered, sending fragments spraying across the corridor. Through the cloud of dust came the first Velthari soldier. Enormous, and alien, and utterly wrong in this space that was too small for something that size. Vega's Marines opened fire. The sound in that confined space was beyond description. Rail rifles cracking, the whine of the Velthari energy weapons answering, ricochets sparking off walls, the wet impact of rounds hitting chitin. The first Velthari went down, then the second, but the third pushed past the bodies of its fallen comrades, and kept coming, and behind it was a column of soldiers stretching back into the darkness of the drill shaft. The mining charges went off. The explosions were small compared to the trap we had set before, but in the tight confines of the corridor, they were devastating. Rock rained from the ceiling. 2 Velthari were buried under falling debris. 3 more were thrown backward by the blast wave. The advancing column stalled, but only for a moment. They regrouped with terrifying speed, that hive-mind coordination, allowing them to reorganize without verbal orders, without hesitation. A second wave pushed forward, climbing over rubble and fallen soldiers with mechanical efficiency. We fought them at the choke point for what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes. 20 minutes of continuous, desperate, close-range combat that I will carry in my memory for the rest of my life. Claire Maddox, who had survived the initial attack on the surface, fired until her rifle overheated, and then picked up a fallen Velthari weapon and kept shooting, figuring out the alien trigger mechanism in the middle of a firefight through sheer determination. A Marine named Victor Dunn held a collapsed section of the barricade, with nothing but a riot shield and his own body weight, refusing to give ground, even as plasma bolts scorched the metal inches from his face. I fired my 12 rounds. I picked up the metal pipe. I am not proud of what happened next, but I am not ashamed of it either. When you are defending children against something that wants to wipe your species from a corner of the galaxy, you do what is necessary, and you do not apologize for it. The Velthari pushed us back, step by step, meter by meter, exactly as they had done on the surface. Their numbers were simply too great. For every one we brought down, more pressed forward. Our ammunition dwindled. Our Marines fell. Corporal Maddox took a plasma bolt to her leg and went down. Victor Dunn was finally pulled back when his shield melted through, and the heat began to burn his arms. I was fighting beside Vega, at what had become the last barricade, when I felt something hit my left side. Not pain, not at first. Just impact. Like being punched by something impossibly hard. I looked down and saw a piece of metal embedded in my body armor, driven through the outer layer by a ricochet or fragment. Blood was already spreading around it, dark and warm. I stayed on my feet. Vega grabbed my shoulder and pulled me behind the barricade. "Stay down, Commander." "Not a chance." He looked at me with an expression I could not read. Then he nodded and turned back to the fight. We were losing. I knew it. Vega knew it. Everyone knew it. The Velthari were going to push through this last barricade and pour into the bunker complex, and then it would be over. Not quickly, not cleanly, but it would be over. And then, at the 11-hour mark exactly, the Velthari stopped pushing. It happened so suddenly that I thought it was a trick. Their advancing soldiers halted. The firing slowed. I watched through a gap in the barricade as the Velthari in the corridor stood motionless, their compound eyes going blank, their weapons lowering. Something had disrupted their hive mind coordination. Something had pulled their attention away from us so completely that the soldiers in front of us became statues. The intercepted communications told me why. I could not understand the Velthari language, but Sophie had been running their transmissions through a rudimentary translation algorithm throughout the fight. She crawled to my position, her tablet clutched in bloody hands, and showed me the screen. The translated fragments were choppy and incomplete, but the meaning was unmistakable. Their fleet above Cygnus 7 was being engaged, not by a patrol, not by a scouting force, by something so massive and so violent that every Velthari unit on the planet had received a simultaneous priority override from their command structure. I dragged myself to the nearest surface camera that was still functioning, a battered unit mounted in a corridor that connected to the ruins above. The image was grainy and distorted, but I could see the sky, and what I saw in that sky made me forget about the metal in my side, and the blood on my hands, and the exhaustion that had turned my bones to lead. Ships, human ships, filling the sky from horizon to horizon. Battlegroup Fenris had arrived, and it was not what I had expected. I had imagined a rescue force, a handful of destroyers and a carrier, something to evacuate us and pull back. What I saw was an invasion fleet. 12 capital ships, each one a city of metal and fury, their hulls bristling with weapon systems that turned the upper atmosphere into a light show of kinetic impacts and energy discharges. Around them swarmed destroyers and frigates and fighter wings, so dense they looked like clouds of angry insects, which was a bitter irony given our enemy. The Velthari fleet above Cygnus 7 tried to respond. They scrambled their warships, turned their weapons toward the incoming armada, broadcast desperate calls for reinforcement on every channel. It did not matter. The human fleet did not negotiate. It did not demand surrender. It did not offer terms. It simply opened fire with everything it had. I watched a Velthari dreadnought, one of the massive capital ships that had been raining destruction on our colony, come apart in real time. The human kinetic lances hit it amidships, one after another, punching through shields that had held against the weapons of a dozen conquered species. The ship broke in half. The two halves drifted apart, trailing fire and debris, and then secondary explosions ripped through the wreckage and turned it into an expanding cloud of glowing fragments. That was one ship. There were over 200 Velthari vessels in orbit. 90 seconds later, there were less than 100. 3 minutes after that, there were none. The sky above Cygnus 7, which had been filled with enemy warships for the worst day of my life, was suddenly, completely, impossibly clear. Below us, in the tunnels, the Velthari ground forces received new orders from whatever remained of their command structure. I did not need Sophie's translator to understand what those orders were. The soldiers in front of our barricade turned and ran. They fled back through the drill shaft, back toward the surface, back toward a landing zone where their transports were already being reduced to burning wreckage by human strike fighters. They did not make it. The human Marines who descended through the ruins of Cygnus 7 were not like the garrison troops I had commanded. These were Fenris soldiers, orbital assault specialists in heavy-powered armor that made them look like something between a human and a tank. They swept through the colony in precise, methodical formations, clearing every corridor, every room, every collapsed section, with the efficiency of people who had trained for exactly this kind of operation. They reached the bunker in under an hour. The first one through the breach was a combat medic. She was young, mid-20s at most, and her armor was spotless because she had not needed to fire a single shot. The Fenris soldiers had handled everything above us with such overwhelming force that the medics had nothing to do but follow in their wake. She knelt beside me, assessed the shrapnel wound in my side with practiced hands, and injected something that made the pain retreat to a distant throbbing. Then she looked me in the eye and said, "Commander Harmon, you are relieved. We have got it from here." I wanted to argue. I wanted to stay on my feet. But my body had been running on adrenaline and stubbornness for over 20 hours, and now that the adrenaline was gone, the stubbornness was not enough. My legs folded. 2 Fenris Marines caught me and carried me toward the surface. They carried me through the ruins of my colony. I saw the destruction up close for the first time. The residential towers were gone, reduced to skeletal frameworks of twisted metal. The hydroponic bay was a crater. The medical research station, where brilliant people had been doing work that might have helped millions, was a pile of scorched rubble. Everything that 4,000 people had built on this little rock at the edge of space was broken. But the people were alive. The ones who had made it underground were alive. 312 civilians and the surviving Marines were being evacuated by Fenris medical teams, loaded onto shuttles, given water and food and blankets, and all the things that seem trivial until you have not had them for a day. Lena Price walked out of the bunker with 23 children following her in a line, each one holding the hand of the child behind them. She was still singing. The Fenris Marines, soldiers who had been trained to face any enemy without flinching, stepped aside and watched her pass in silence. Elliot, the teenager who had hauled ammunition boxes without being asked, walked out carrying a wounded Marine on his back. The Marine outweighed him by at least 30 pounds. A Fenris medic tried to take over, and Elliot shook his head. "I have got him. He held the line for us. I can carry him out." Graham Cole was the last civilian to leave the bunker. He walked slowly, leaning on a makeshift cane, his geological hammer still tucked into his belt. He paused at the exit, turned around, and looked back into the darkness of the tunnels that had sheltered us. Then he turned forward and walked into the light. They carried me to a medevac shuttle. As they loaded me in, I passed a tactical display mounted on the wall of the craft. It showed the local space around Cygnus 7, the positions of every ship in the area. I saw Battle Group Fenris, its 12 capital ships, and their escorts, holding orbital positions around the colony. I saw the debris fields that had once been the Velthari fleet. And I saw something else, something that made the blood drain from my face despite the painkillers. Battle Group Fenris was not the main fleet. On the tactical display, moving at speeds that the computer had to compress to fit on the screen, was another formation of ships. Not 12 capital ships. Over 200. Dreadnoughts, assault carriers, bombardment platforms, and vessel types I did not recognize. Ships so large that the display had to use a different scale to represent them. They had already passed Cygnus 7. They were not stopping. They were not turning. Their trajectory was a straight line that cut across the map like a wound, aimed directly at the heart of Velthari sovereign space. Their heading was Velthara Prime, the Velthari homeworld. I stared at that display as the shuttle lifted off. The painkillers made everything feel distant, dreamlike. But the numbers on the screen were real, the heading was real, and the meaning was real. Earth had not sent a rescue force. Earth had sent an answer. I spent 4 days in the medical bay of the carrier Vanguard of Wrath. That name should tell you something about the mood aboard that ship. Nobody was celebrating. Nobody was exchanging stories or sharing drinks, or doing any of the things that soldiers are supposed to do after a successful operation. The crew of the Vanguard moved through their duties with a quiet, focused intensity that reminded me of a coiled spring, something wound so tight that the energy inside it had become perfectly still. On the second day, my attending physician, a naval surgeon named Fiona Drake, told me that the shrapnel had missed my kidney by less than a centimeter. She said it with the casual tone of someone who had delivered worse news to better patients. She cleared me for limited mobility on day 3, which meant I could walk the corridors in a medical gown with a bandage around my torso and an expression that discouraged conversation. I did not want to talk. I wanted to understand. On day 4, A naval intelligence officer found me in the observation lounge. He was a compact man, with gray at his temples, and the kind of eyes that had seen classified things. He introduced himself as Commander Noel Bishop. He said that Admiral Sato wanted me in the CIC, the Combat Information Center, and that my presence was not optional. "Why me?" I asked. Bishop looked at me with something that might have been sympathy. "You sent the distress signal, Commander. The Admiral wants the man who started this to see how it ends." They gave me a uniform. Not my old colonial service khakis, but a proper Navy uniform. Dark blue, pressed, bearing the insignia of an officer attached to Fleet Command. It did not fit perfectly, but nothing about this situation fit perfectly. So I wore it. The CIC of the Vanguard of Wrath was a vast chamber, buried deep in the heart of the carrier. Holographic displays covered every surface, projecting tactical data, fleet positions, communications intercepts, and a real-time map of Velthari space that showed the main fleet advancing like a tide of blue markers sweeping across the red territory of the Dominion. Admiral Kurasato stood at the center of it all. She was smaller than I expected. Every image I had seen of her suggested a towering presence, but she was barely 5'4", a compact woman in her 60s, with close-cropped silver hair and a face that had been weathered by decades of service into something that resembled carved stone. She did not raise her voice. She did not gesture dramatically. She stood perfectly still and issued orders in a tone that assumed, correctly, that every word would be obeyed without question. She saw me enter and nodded once. "Commander Harmon, take a position at the observation station. You are here to witness." I took the station. Bishop stood beside me, occasionally explaining what I was seeing on the displays. The main fleet had crossed into Velthari sovereign space 12 hours earlier. No species had ever done this. The Velthari Dominion had existed for 12,000 years, expanding methodically, conquering species that resisted, absorbing those that submitted. Their borders were considered inviolable. Their military was considered the most powerful in the sector. Their homeworld, Velthara Prime, was a fortress surrounded by defense platforms, minefields, and a home fleet that had never been challenged. In the 12 hours since the human fleet had entered their space, the Velthari had thrown everything they had at it. Bishop walked me through the engagements, as the tactical recordings played back on the display. The first encounter was at a Velthari border fortress, a massive station, bristling with weapons that guarded the main approach to their inner systems. The human fleet did not slow down. The lead dreadnoughts fired their kinetic lance batteries at maximum range, punching through the station's shields with synchronized volleys that concentrated enough force on single points to overwhelm the defensive screens. The station's weapons fired back, scoring hits on the human ships, damaging armor plating, knocking out secondary systems. But the human ships kept coming. Their armor was thicker than anything the Velthari had encountered. Their damage control teams sealed breaches in minutes. Their weapons kept firing with mechanical precision that never wavered. The border fortress fell in 40 minutes. The human fleet did not stop to secure it. They flew through the debris and kept going. The second encounter was with the Velthari's mobile defense fleet, a force of over 300 warships that had been assembled to intercept the human advance. This was the Dominion's pride. Ships that had conquered civilizations, that had broken the back of every species foolish enough to challenge Velthari supremacy. They outnumbered the human fleet 3-1, and they fought with the coordinated fury of a hive mind that had 12,000 years of military experience encoded in its collective memory. It was not enough. I watched the engagement replay on the tactical display, and I began to understand something that the Velthari never had. Humanity had been quiet for 80 years. We had joined the galactic community, established our colonies, built our trade routes, and kept our heads down. Every other species had interpreted this as weakness. They saw our short lifespans and assumed we were fragile. They saw our emotional nature and assumed we were soft. They saw our small territory and assumed we were insignificant. They had not seen what we were building. The human ships were faster than the Velthari had anticipated. Their weapons were more powerful. Their shields used a technology that the Velthari sensors could not properly analyze. Adaptive frequency barriers that shifted in response to incoming fire, becoming stronger against whatever had just hit them. And the autonomous drone swarms that launched from the human carriers were something entirely new. thousands of small, fast, intelligent combat units that adapted to Velthari tactics in real time, learning and evolving during the battle itself. The Velthari mobile defense fleet was destroyed in 3 hours, 170 human ships against 300 Velthari warships, and the Velthari lost. Not barely lost. Not lost after a grinding battle of attrition that cost both sides dearly. They were taken apart with surgical precision, their formations broken, their coordination disrupted by electronic warfare systems that targeted the hive mind frequencies with scrambling pulses that turned coordinated fleets into confused mobs of individual ships. The human fleet lost 11 ships. The Velthari lost all 300. I sat at my station and watched the recordings, and felt something I was not prepared for. Not satisfaction, not relief, something darker and more complicated. The Galactic Concord reacted. They could not ignore what was happening. Messages flooded in on diplomatic channels from species across the sector. Some were demands for restraint, some were warnings, some were outright threats. The elder species who ran the Concord, ancient civilizations that had maintained the galactic order for millennia, informed Earth that what they were doing was a violation of interstellar law, an act of aggression disproportionate to the original offense, and that there would be consequences. I read some of those messages on the CIC displays. The Korathi Federation invoked 7 different treaties and demanded an immediate ceasefire. The Lorene Assembly offered to mediate, their language thick with the diplomatic euphemisms that ancient species use when they are too proud to beg directly. One message, from a species I had never heard of called the Tanari Communion, simply stated that humanity would be expelled from the Concord and treated as a rogue state if the advance continued. None of them mentioned Cygnus 7. Not one of those messages acknowledged the attack that had started all of this. The Galactic Concord had spent 72 hours debating the incident at Cygnus 7 and had classified it as a bilateral matter not warranting Concord intervention. 4,200 people died while the elder species discussed procedure. Admiral Sato received these messages. She read each one. And then she broadcast her response on an open channel, so every species with a receiver tuned to diplomatic frequencies would hear it. The Velthari Dominion launched an unprovoked attack on a human civilian outpost. They targeted residential areas. They targeted medical facilities. They targeted children. When we sent our distress signal, the Galactic Concord classified it as a regional dispute and declined to intervene. You watched 4,200 of our people suffer and die, and you called it a matter for bilateral negotiation. So, this is our bilateral negotiation, and we will not be accepting any amendments. The bridge crew did not react. They had heard this speech before, or one like it. They continued their duties. But I saw the set of their jaws and the steadiness of their hands, and I understood that every person on this ship believed in what was happening. The Concord's response was silence, not because they had nothing to say, but because they understood that nothing they said would change what was coming. The fleet reached the Velthara Prime system on the morning of the 5th day. I was in the CIC. I had not slept. I did not want to sleep. I wanted to see. The Velthari home fleet was waiting. 800 warships, the largest concentration of military force the Dominion had ever assembled, arranged in concentric defensive rings around their homeworld. Behind them, orbital defense platforms the size of small moons, their weapons charged and ready. Behind those, minefields so dense they looked like clouds of metal on the sensors. And behind everything, Velthara Prime itself, a massive world with swirling golden atmospheres and sprawling cities that covered entire continents, the heart of a civilization that had been old when humanity was still learning to make fire. The Supreme Matriarch broadcast a message. The translation came through the CIC speakers in a flat, synthesized voice that did not capture the emotion of the original, but conveyed the words clearly enough. She offered full surrender, immediate withdrawal from all contested territories, return of all human prisoners and remains, reparations calculated at whatever amount Earth demanded, public execution of every military commander who had been involved in the decision to attack Cygnus 7, complete and unconditional capitulation. It was everything that a rational, proportionate response would have demanded. Admiral Soto listened to the full message. Then she turned to her communications officer and said one sentence: "You attacked our children." The communications officer broadcast those 4 words on the same open channel that had carried the matriarch's surrender. Nothing else, no counteroffer, no terms, no negotiation. 4 words, and the largest military engagement in galactic history began. The human fleet did not attack the home fleet head-on. That would have been brave but wasteful. Instead, the drone swarms launched first, hundreds of thousands of autonomous units that flooded the defensive perimeter with targets too numerous to track. The Velthari defense platforms fired on the drones, their massive weapons carving swathes through the swarms. But for every drone destroyed, 2 more took its place, and while the platforms were occupied with the swarm, the human capital ships maneuvered into firing positions. The kinetic lances spoke, and the Velthari defense platforms began to die. I will not describe the full battle. It lasted 9 hours. It was conducted with a combination of technological superiority and tactical brilliance that I, as a colonial garrison commander, was not qualified to fully appreciate. But I understood the broad strokes. The drone swarms overwhelmed the defenses. The electronic warfare systems disrupted the hive mind coordination. The capital ships punched through the defensive rings one by one, absorbing damage that would have destroyed lesser vessels and continuing to advance. Bishop narrated when I could not follow the tactical displays. He pointed out the moments that would later be studied in military academies across a dozen species. The way the human fleet split into 3 prongs to force the Velthari to divide their defensive formations. The coordinated electronic pulse that knocked out the hive mind relay network for 11 critical seconds, during which the Velthari fleet became 800 individual ships, instead of 1 coordinated organism. The precision strike that eliminated the Velthari flagship and the senior coordinating intelligence aboard it, turning a disciplined defense into a series of disjointed, panicking responses. The Velthari home fleet fought with everything they had. They fought with the desperation of a species defending its birthplace. They fought with courage and sacrifice, and the accumulated military tradition of 12,000 years. Individual Velthari captains rammed their ships into human vessels when their weapons failed. Squadrons launched suicide attacks against the human carriers. Defense platform crews stayed at their posts, even as their stations disintegrated around them. I watched one Velthari cruiser, its weapons spent and its engines failing, turn directly into the path of a human dreadnought and accelerate. The collision tore a gash in the dreadnought's port side that vented 3 decks to space. The dreadnought sealed the breach, adjusted its heading, and kept firing. It did not even slow down. It was not enough. By the end of the 9th hour, the home fleet was gone. The defense platforms were debris. The minefields had been swept clean by the drone swarms, and the human fleet held orbit above Velthara Prime, 200 warships, looking down at a world that had never known the shadow of a foreign military. Admiral Sato looked at the planet on the main display. She was silent for a long time. The CIC held its breath. Then she gave the order. Deploy the Archon warheads. I knew what Archon warheads were. Every officer in the service knew, even though most of us had believed we would never see them used. Planet crackers. Weapons designed to penetrate a planet's crust and trigger cascading tectonic failures that would render the world uninhabitable. Humanity had built them during the early years of the colonial expansion, when the possibility of encountering a hostile species powerful enough to threaten Earth itself was still a theoretical concern. They had been classified at the highest level. Their existence was officially denied, and they had been banned by Earth's own government from use against any natural world. But Velthara Prime was not being classified as a natural world. Not anymore. I watched the first warhead descend into the atmosphere. The surface of Velthara Prime rippled. I do not know how else to describe what I saw on the display in the CIC. The planet's crust moved like water disturbed by a stone, concentric waves of geological disruption spreading outward from the impact point of the first Archon warhead. Mountains shifted. Fault lines that had been stable for millions of years cracked open in seconds. The golden atmosphere turned dark as dust and debris rose from a wound in the planet's surface that was visible from orbit. Then the second warhead hit, and the third, and the fourth. Each one struck a different tectonic junction, a carefully calculated point where the planet's crust was thinnest, where the forces locked beneath the surface were strongest. This was not random destruction. It was engineering. Terrible, precise engineering, designed to unravel a planet's geology the way you might unravel a knot, finding the key threads and pulling them until the whole structure came apart. I stood at my observation station and watched, and I did not look away, because I had been told I was here to witness. So, I witnessed. The oceans boiled, not metaphorically. The thermal energy released by the cascading tectonic failures superheated the water in the shallow seas, turning them to steam that rose in towering columns visible from space. The cities, those sprawling metropolises that covered entire continents, cracked and fell into the widening fissures. Orbital stations that had maintained communication with the surface went dark one by one as the infrastructure below them was consumed. The whole process took 17 minutes. 17 minutes to end something that had existed for 12,000 years. 17 minutes to turn a thriving world into a geological nightmare of molten rock and toxic atmosphere and endless, spreading fire. Earth had broadcast evacuation orders 72 hours before the fleet arrived, repeating messages on every Velthari frequency, in every Velthari dialect that human linguists had catalogued, telling the population to evacuate, to leave, to get off the planet by any means available. Some had listened. Civilian transports had been departing the system since the warnings began, and the human fleet had let every single one of them pass through the blockade untouched. Millions had escaped. But billions had not. Many could not. The Velthari civilian infrastructure was not designed for mass evacuation. Many of their population were non-mobile worker castes, biologically integrated into the hive structures of their cities, physically incapable of leaving. Others had refused to believe it would happen. Their matriarch had offered surrender. Surely the humans would accept. Surely they would be rational. Surely they would be proportionate. We were not proportionate. I turned away from the display. I found a chair. I sat down. The CIC around me continued to function, officers monitoring the operation, tracking the geological cascade, coordinating the fleet's withdrawal to safe distance. Business as usual aboard a warship, except the business was the destruction of a world. Fiona Drake, my physician, found me in the observation lounge later. I do not know how much time had passed. She sat down across from me and said nothing for several minutes. Then she handed me a cup of water. "Drink," she said. "Dehydration will not help whatever you are feeling." I drank. The water tasted like nothing. "I wanted justice," I said. I was not talking to her specifically. I was talking to the silence. I wanted the people who killed the families at Cygnus 7 to answer for it. I wanted it to mean something. And now? I looked at her. Now, I do not know what this means. I do not know what we have become. She did not offer comfort. She was a military surgeon. Comfort was not in her professional vocabulary, but she stayed. Sometimes presence is enough. I sat in that lounge for a long time after she left. The observation window showed the void of space, calm and indifferent, the same view it had always been. Somewhere behind us, a planet was dying. Somewhere ahead, a galaxy was recalibrating its understanding of the species called humanity. And I was sitting in a chair between those two realities, trying to figure out which one I belonged to. I found Admiral Sato the following morning. She was in her ready room, a small, Spartan space adjacent to the CIC. She was reading reports, her expression unchanged from the one she had worn throughout the entire operation. I requested permission to ask a question. She granted it. "Was this necessary?" I asked. She looked up from her reports. Her eyes were steady, neither cold nor warm, but something in between that I had never encountered before. The eyes of someone who had done something irreversible and was prepared to carry the weight of it for the rest of her life. "Necessary," she repeated, as if tasting the word. "No, it was not necessary. We could have accepted the matriarch's surrender. We could have imposed sanctions, demanded reparations, stationed a peacekeeping fleet in their space. We could have done what the Galactic Concord would have done, proportionate, reasonable, measured. And in 10 years, or 20, or 50, another species would have looked at a human outpost and done the same calculation the Velthari did. They would have decided that the cost of attacking us was manageable, that the humans would protest and negotiate and ultimately accept, and another colony would have burned. She paused. I waited. What we did today will save more lives than we took. Not because it was just, not because it was right, but because every species in this galaxy will remember what happened to the Velthari Dominion, and they will choose differently. That is not justice, Commander Harmon. It is arithmetic, and I will answer for it when the time comes. I left her ready room with no resolution, no clarity, just the weight of what I had seen, and the knowledge that the galaxy had changed in ways that could not be reversed. The aftermath came in waves, each one larger and more complicated than the last. The Galactic Concord convened an emergency session. Species that had not spoken to each other in centuries sent representatives. The debate was furious, divided, and ultimately inconclusive. Some condemned Earth in the strongest possible terms. The Karathi Federation called it genocide. The Lorene Assembly called it an atrocity without precedent. The Dreneth Collective compared humanity to a plague that needed to be contained before it spread. Others said nothing publicly, but privately, through back channels and encrypted messages that were not supposed to exist, communications reached Earth from species that had spent centuries under Velthari pressure. Small civilizations that had been forced to pay tribute, surrender territory, accept humiliating terms dictated by the Dominion. These messages were not condemnations. They were not celebrations either. They were something more complicated. Acknowledgments, perhaps. Recognition that something terrible had happened, and that the galaxy was different because of it, and that the difference was not entirely unwelcome to those who had lived in the Dominion's shadow. The Velthari survivors scattered, millions of them, spread across their colonial holdings and the refugee corridors that opened in the weeks following the destruction of their homeworld. Their civilization did not end with their planet, not entirely. The Velthari were a resilient species. They would rebuild somewhere, regroup, start again. But they would do so without the military power that had defined them for millennia, and they would do so in a galaxy that now knew, with absolute certainty, what happened when you attacked a human outpost. I returned to Cygnus 7 4 months later. The colony was being rebuilt, not restored, because you cannot restore something that has been destroyed, rebuilt, from the ground up, with new materials and new designs and new defenses that would have seemed absurd 4 months ago. The garrison had been increased from 300 to 3,000. Orbital defense platforms circled the planet. A permanent naval detachment maintained a presence in the system. Nobody would ever call Cygnus 7 a minor outpost again. They had built a memorial wall near the center of the new colony. It was a long wall, made of dark stone quarried from the local bedrock, and on it were carved the names of every person who had died in the attack. 4,200 names. I walked along that wall and read every single one of them. It took me over an hour. I owed them that time. Sergeant Vega was still there. He had been offered a transfer, a promotion, a post on one of the capital ships. He had turned down every offer. He said Cygnus 7 was his post, and he intended to stay. He was the same as he had always been, calm, steady, unshakable, except that now he walked with a slight limp from an injury he refused to talk about, and his eyes carried something new, a depth that had not been there before. Sophie Grant had been given a commendation and a position at Earth's Central Communications Facility. She had declined and stayed at Cygnus 7 to rebuild the comms network. She said someone had to make sure the signal would get through next time. She said it with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Graham Cole had gone home. His health had deteriorated after the siege, and the doctors told him that the stress had damaged his heart. He sent me a message before he left. It said, "We held, Commander. That is what matters. Tell the children we held." Lena Price was still teaching. The school was temporary, set up in a pressurized tent while the new buildings were constructed. She had 23 students now, children who had survived the bunker. She was teaching them history, mathematics, literature, and a new subject she had added to the curriculum. She called it resilience. I asked her what it involved, and she said, "I teach them that falling down is not the end. Getting back up is not enough either. You have to get back up and build something better than what was there before." I attended the first diplomatic reception held at the rebuilt colony. It was a strange event. Representatives from a dozen species came, some out of genuine interest in building relations with humanity, others out of a curiosity that bordered on morbid fascination. They walked the new corridors. They admired the new defenses. They were polite, respectful, and very careful. I watched them closely. The Korathi delegation moved through the colony with the nervous precision of people navigating a room full of sleeping predators. Their lead diplomat, a six-limbed being covered in fine golden fur, asked polite questions about the reconstruction and complimented the architectural choices, but his eyes kept drifting to the weapons emplacements visible through the observation windows. The Lurine representatives spoke in hushed tones among themselves, their bioluminescent patches flickering in patterns that I had been told indicated deep anxiety. Even the Dreneth, a species known for their blunt manner and aggressive trade negotiations, chose their words with unusual care. The galaxy had learned a new vocabulary when dealing with humanity, and every word in it was chosen to avoid giving offense. One delegation in particular caught my attention: the Varath Compact, a mid-tier civilization that had previously refused to even acknowledge human sovereignty over Cygnus 7. They arrived with gifts and a draft treaty that offered full diplomatic recognition, trade agreements, and a mutual defense pact. Their ambassador was a tall, thin being, with translucent skin and large dark eyes. He presented the treaty to me with hands that trembled slightly. I accepted the gifts. I forwarded the treaty to Earth for review. And I looked into the ambassador's dark eyes and recognized what I saw there. I had seen it in the Velthari soldiers who fled the tunnels when Battlegroup Fenris arrived. I had seen it in the intercepted communications from species across the galaxy as the news of Velthara Prime spread. It was not respect. Respect is what you feel for an equal. Respect comes from understanding and admiration and the recognition of shared values. This was fear. I stood on the observation deck of the rebuilt colony that evening and looked up at the stars. The sky above Cygnus 7 was clear and deep, filled with the light of distant suns that harbored civilizations I would never meet. Somewhere out there, the Velthari survivors were picking up the pieces of their shattered empire. Somewhere out there, 100 species were recalculating their threat assessments of humanity. Somewhere out there, the Galactic Concord was debating what to do about the new most dangerous species in the sector. The galaxy was quieter now. I did not know if that silence was peace or just the sound of every other civilization holding its breath, waiting to see what humanity would do next. There is a difference between a galaxy at peace and a galaxy at pause, and I was not certain which one we had created. I thought about Admiral Sato's words. Arithmetic, she had called it. The cold calculation that the destruction of one world would prevent the destruction of many others. I understood the logic. I even believed, in the analytical part of my mind that dealt in probabilities and strategic outcomes, that she was probably right. No species would look at a human colony and see an easy target ever again. The children of Cygnus 7 would grow up in safety because of what had been done in their name. But I also thought about the children of Velthara Prime, the ones who had not made it to the evacuation transports, the ones who had been born into a civilization that had made terrible choices and paid a price they had no part in choosing. They were not guilty of anything. They were simply in the way when humanity decided to make a point. I did not resolve these thoughts. I do not think they can be resolved. They exist together. The gratitude and the guilt, the relief and the horror, the knowledge that we were safe, and the understanding of what that safety had cost someone else. This is what it means to be human in a galaxy that does not grade on a curve. You carry the weight of what you have done, and you keep walking, because the alternative is to sit down and never move again. A young Marine approached me on the observation deck. She was new to Cygnus 7, part of the expanded garrison, fresh from the academy, and assigned to the frontier, because that was where the action was. She saluted and asked if I was Commander Harmon. I said I was. She said, "I wanted to tell you, sir, that your distress signal is part of our training now. They play it at the academy. Every cadet hears it." I did not know that. I asked her what the instructors said about it. She thought for a moment. "They say it is the most important 20 seconds of audio in the history of the colonial service, because it proved that no matter how far out you go, no matter how small your outpost, if you call for help, Earth will answer." I looked at her. She was young. She believed in the system she served. She believed that what had happened was straightforward. A colony attacked, a signal sent, a response delivered. She did not yet carry the complications that come with seeing the full picture. I hoped she never would. "Thank you," I said, dismissed. She left. I stayed on the deck. The evening light painted the colony in shades of amber and gold. Construction drones moved across the skyline, their lights blinking like artificial stars against the darkening sky. I could hear music from somewhere, a guitar being played in one of the recreation modules, something slow and gentle that drifted through the corridors and made the place feel, for just a moment, like a home and not a fortress. I thought about Nathan Webb, who had handed me that cup of cold coffee a lifetime ago in the comms room. He had survived. He was back at his station, running communications for the rebuilt colony, doing the same job with the same quiet competence. When I visited him on my first day back, he handed me another cup of cold coffee and smiled and said nothing. I thought about Derek Hale, the young private who had held the bunker entrance. They had found his body in the rubble when the Fenris Marines cleared the tunnels. He had taken down 4 Velthari before they overwhelmed him. He was 22 years old. His name was on the memorial wall, 4th row from the top, carved in letters that would last as long as the stone held. I visited that name every morning. I did not know what to say to it, so I just stood there in silence and hoped that wherever he was, he knew that his sacrifice had mattered. I thought about the Velthari, not the soldiers or the matriarch or the military commanders who had ordered the attack. I thought about the ordinary Velthari, the workers and the builders and the parents, if their species had something equivalent to parents, who had woken up one morning in a civilization that had stood for 12,000 years and gone to sleep that night with no civilization at all. I wondered if they understood why it had happened. I wondered if understanding would have made any difference. Below me, the colony hummed with the sounds of construction and life, and the stubborn human insistence on building things in places where someone had tried to burn them down. The memorial wall was visible from here, a dark line in the landscape, a reminder of what had been lost and what that loss had unleashed. The galaxy watched us now, every species, every civilization, every empire that had ever looked at humanity and seen something small and soft and temporary. They watched us with new eyes, and in those eyes was a question that none of them dared to ask out loud. Not, will the humans attack us? That fear was there, but it was not the real question. The real question was simpler and more frightening. It was the question that kept ambassadors awake and made military planners lose their appetite and turned the comfortable assumption of human insignificance into something that could never be comfortable again. The question was, what else are they hiding? I looked up at the stars one last time. They were beautiful. They had always been beautiful. Humanity had come to those stars hoping to find wonder and friendship and the shared joy of exploration. We had found some of those things. We had also found that the galaxy was not a gentle place, that it rewarded strength and punished weakness, and that the price of safety was a willingness to be terrifying. We had paid that price. I did not know if we would ever stop paying it. But our children would sleep safely tonight. Every human child, on every colony, on every outpost scattered across the frontier, they would sleep safely because the galaxy now knew, with absolute and permanent clarity, what happened when you touched them. They wanted to teach us our place in the galaxy. We taught them theirs, and we wrote the lesson in fire.